Hi, this is Frank Parson from www.pedometersource.com. Today we're going to be talking about how to buy a pedometer. There's a few things that we're going to talk about in terms of what to look for in a pedometer in this video. We're going to talk about accuracy, the basic features that every pedometer's got to have, some advanced features that are nice, and then the top choice for pedometer on the market today. Accuracy is the number one thing that you want to look for. You want to make sure that every time you take a step that your pedometer is counting it. If it doesn't count every time you take a step, it's undercounting and it's not really accurately reflecting your level of activity. At the same time, you don't want it to count steps when you really weren't taking a step. Like if you were sitting in a chair and shifting around or driving in your car and you hit a bump, that's not a step, and you don't want your pedometer to count those. Old style pedometers were mechanical, they had gears, and they weren't very accurate. But that's really 1970s, 1980s technology. You don't really see those on the market very much today. Most of the pedometers that you see out there are going to be digital pedometers that have got a pendulum. What that means is there's a little weight on a stick, and every time you take a step, when your heel hits the ground, it makes that weight bob, and there's an electric counter that counts a step. These are pretty accurate, but you can see that if you're driving in a car and you hit a bump and the weight moves up and down, the pedometer may count that as a step. Finally, the most accurate pedometers, and there aren't very many of these on the market right now, but they're ones that use accelerometers, which is a little electronic device that measures acceleration. And it can tell the difference between the acceleration of you taking a step and versus shifting in your chair or driving in your car down the road. Some of the basic features that you want to see in a pedometer are it's got to count steps. It's really not a pedometer if it doesn't count steps. That's the most basic, and you'll see pedometers that's all they do. They count steps. One nice addition is a distance calculator. What this does is take the length of your stride, say 2 feet, 2.5 feet, 3 feet, and then it multiplies that by the number of steps you've taken. So if you've walked 10,000 steps in a day and your stride length is 2 feet, then you'll have walked 20,000 feet, which is about 4 miles. Now these are going to be just approximations because everyone takes a different length of stride depending on whether you're walking slowly or if you're in a hurry, but it kind of translates things into something that we can think of. It's a little more clear to us if you say, I walked 5 miles today versus I walked 25,000 steps. It makes a little bit more sense. A calorie counter is also nice to have. Again, this is something that's just an approximation. It takes the number of steps that you've walked, and then most of them have you input your weight. And then from that, it kind of makes an assumption of how many calories you've burned. Again, it's an approximation because there's a big difference between somebody that weighs 200 pounds and they're all muscle versus 200 pounds if they have more fat, and they're going to burn calories at a different rate. But it's still nice to know whether that afternoon snack you've had, if you've walked enough steps yet to have burned that off. There are some advanced features that you can also look for in a pedometer. I don't think all of these are necessary, but there's a lot of pedometers on the market today that have some or all of these features. A memory is one I think that is good because if you're really dedicated to a walking program, you're probably keeping a pedometer log of keeping track of how many steps you've walked each day. And a lot of pedometers will reset themselves at midnight, and so, or you'll have to reset them yourself. And so if you haven't written down how many steps you've taken for that day, if you forgot to or you were busy or whatever reason, then your log's going to have a hole in it and you're just going to have to sort of make some assumptions as to what it is. So a lot of pedometers with a memory will have a 7-day memory, which I think is the best, and that lets you keep track of a whole week's worth of data. There's some pedometers out there with radios or MP3 players. I'm not really a big fan of these. I think most of the radios in pedometers just don't work very well. You're better off just having a separate radio that you carry around with you. The same thing with MP3 players. They're big, and bulky, and you really wouldn't want to wear a combination pedometer MP3 player around all day. You can't really put it on your belt or have it in your pocket and not have people know that you've got something there. I mean, it may be good for a conversation starter, but I think you're better off going with a separate MP3 player if you want to listen to music when you walk. There's some pedometers out there that have a light that flashes so that when you're walking at night, it's easier for drivers to see you. I'm not a big fan of these either because I think it eats up the battery a lot more quickly than the pedometer on its own. I think you're better off getting a good, flashing LED light that will use a lot less batteries than the lights that are in pedometers. There's some pedometers that will take your pulse, but again, these aren't that accurate and they just add to the cost of the pedometer. You're better off just checking your pulse manually for 15 seconds. I mean, that's free rather than paying more for an inaccurate pulse counter. Finally, there are a few pedometers out there that have what's called an aerobic step counter. What these tend to do is if you're more active and you're walking at a certain rate for a certain amount of time, so if you take a step every second or so for 10 minutes, it counts that as concentrated activity, and it gives you a separate summary of the number of aerobic steps that you've taken in that day. So you may have walked 10,000 steps in a day, but maybe only 1,000 of those were aerobic, where you walk them all in one period. Then you know that you get a lot of steps in a day, but they're just kind of a few here and a few there, versus somebody that maybe only walks 5,000 steps in a day, but all 5,000 of them were aerobic steps. And you know that person went for a good, long, brisk walk. So keeping all of these factors in mind, what's the top choice for a pedometer out there today? I think it's the Omron HJ112, which is also known as the Omron walking style pedometer. It's the most accurate pedometer out there because it's got an accelerometer, so it doesn't count missteps as much as some of the other pedometers out there on the market. It also comes with a calorie and distance counter, which, again, these are approximations, but it's nice information to have. And it's got a 7-day memory, so if you're keeping a log, you've got 7 days worth of memory there in case you don't write it down every day. And it has that aerobic steps counter, which I think is a nice motivator, because if I look at the pedometer and I see, well, I've walked 6,000 steps today, but none of them have been aerobic, then I know that I ought to get out there and go for a good long walk and get in some more concentrated exercise. Well, that's it. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like more information on pedometers and pedometer walking and fitness, visit our blog at www.pedometersource.com. Thank you very much.